The millionaire who cast out a cat. What happened next shocked everyone. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, stood like a monument to isolation. Its wrought iron gates gleamed with perfection. The manicured lawns stretched in mathematical precision, and every curtain remained drawn against the outside world. Inside these walls lived Edmund Hale, a 72-year-old millionaire who had built his fortune in real estate development, only to watch it become meaningless the day his wife Margaret passed away 3 years earlier. Edmund's daily routine had become a prison of his own making. Breakfast at 7 sharp served by his longtime butler Clifton in the echoing dining room. Business calls conducted from his oak-paneled study, where he managed his investments with mechanical precision. Lunch alone at his massive table, dinner the same. The evening hours stretched endlessly as he sat among his collection of priceless artwork. Paintings that once sparked joy now stared back at him like lifeless eyes. The house that had once hosted charity galas and dinner parties for Connecticut's elite now stood as silent as a tomb. Edmund had systematically cut ties with everyone who reminded him of Margaret. Friends stopped calling after months of declined invitations. His late wife's garden, once her pride and joy, had been paved over and replaced with sterile concrete. Even the Grand Library, where Margaret had spent countless hours reading to local children, remained locked, its key hidden away like a shameful secret. "Will there be anything else this evening, Mr. Hale?" Clifton asked each night, his weathered face etched with concern for his employer's increasing withdrawal from the world. "Nothing," Edmund would reply curtly, not looking up from whatever meaningless document occupied his attention. "Lock up and leave me be." It was on a crisp October afternoon, when the Connecticut maples blazed with autumn fire, that everything began to change. Edmund was reviewing quarterly reports in his study when Clifton knocked softly on the door. "Sir, there appears to be a visitor at the side entrance." Edmund looked up, annoyed. "I've told you repeatedly, no visitors. Send them away." "It's not exactly a person, sir, it's a cat." Edmund's jaw tightened. Animals were another reminder of life he'd rather avoid. Margaret had always wanted pets, but Edmund had considered them messy disruptions to an orderly life. Now the very thought seemed like salt in an old wound. "Then call animal control and have it removed." "Of course, sir." Clifton hesitated at the door. "Though I should mention, it's been sitting there for over 2 hours. Hasn't moved once." Through his study window, Edmund caught his first glimpse of the intruder. The cat was unlike any stray he'd ever seen, its coat a lustrous silver grey that caught the afternoon light, its amber eyes fixed on the mansion with an unsettling intensity. It sat perfectly still beside the side entrance, as if it belonged there, as if it had always belonged there. The next morning it was back, and the morning after that. Each day Edmund instructed Clifton to shoo it away, and each day the cat returned to its chosen spot. But what irritated Edmund most wasn't the cat's persistence. It was the small offerings it left behind. First, it was a perfectly straight twig, placed precisely parallel to the doorframe. Then came a smooth riverstone, positioned with mathematical accuracy. Each morning brought a new gift, a fallen leaf arranged just so, a discarded bottle cap cleaned and polished. Edmund found himself walking to the side entrance each day to remove these offerings, and in doing so, he began to notice details he'd ignored for years. The way morning light filtered through the oak trees Margaret had insisted on planting, the sound of children laughing as they walked to school down the tree-lined street, the rich scent of autumn earth after rain. For brief moments, standing there collecting the cat's mysterious gifts, Edmund felt almost peaceful. Then he'd remember why he was there and march back inside, more irritated than before. "Have you discovered where it comes from?" Edmund asked Clifton during one of their morning briefings. "I've made some inquiries, sir. No one in the neighborhood recognizes it. The veterinarian's office has no record of it. It appears to be, well, homeless." The word hung in the air. Homeless. Like Edmund felt some days, rattling around his vast mansion, surrounded by wealth but empty of warmth. 3 weeks into October, the first real test came. Halloween night brought a parade of costumed children to the neighborhood, though none had dared approach the Hale mansion in years. Edmund watched from his darkened study as groups of little ghosts and superheroes walked past his gates, parents hurrying them along with whispered warnings about the old man who lives there. But the cat, whom Clifton had started referring to as their grey visitor, showed no fear of the children. When a small girl dressed as a fairy accidentally dropped her candy bag near the gate, the cat approached and sat beside it, as if guarding her treasure until she returned. The girl's mother initially pulled her away, but the cat's gentle demeanor was so disarming that she allowed her daughter to retrieve her candy. Edmund watched from behind his curtain as the little girl reached down to pet the cat's head. The animal leaned into her touch with such natural trust that Edmund felt something crack inside his chest, a longing so sharp it took his breath away. When was the last time he'd allowed anyone that close? When had he last felt that kind of simple, uncomplicated connection? Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. That night, as autumn rain drummed against his windows, Edmund sat alone in his study nursing a glass of brandy. The cat would be out there somewhere, seeking shelter from the storm. Despite himself, he found the thought troubling. He'd never been a man given to sentiment about animals, but there was something about this particular cat that unsettled him. Its persistence, its strange gifts. The way it looked at him with those knowing amber eyes. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Sir?" Clifton's voice was gentler than usual. "The neighborhood association has left some correspondence." Edmund's blood pressure spiked as he read the formal complaint. Apparently, several residents had noticed the stray animal and were demanding its removal. They cited property values, health concerns, and neighborhood standards. The letter was signed by Martha Hendricks, president of the Greenwich Estates Homeowners Association, a woman Edmund had once considered a friend before he'd withdrawn from society. "Ungrateful busybodies," Edmund muttered, crumpling the letter. "After all the money I've donated to their precious community projects." But embarrassment burned hotter than anger. The thought of his neighbors discussing him, pitying him, viewing him as the eccentric recluse who couldn't even control a stray cat, it was unbearable. The next morning, Edmund marched to the side entrance with grim determination. The cat was there, as always, but this time it had brought something different. A small cluster of late-blooming chrysanthemums arranged in a perfect circle. Margaret's favorite flower. Something snapped inside Edmund. All the grief, the loneliness, the suffocating weight of 3 years spent hiding from life, it all focused into rage at this innocent animal that dared to remind him of what he'd lost. "Get away from here!" he shouted, grabbing a bucket of ice water from the servants' entrance. "I don't want you here, do you understand? You're not wanted." The cat looked up at him with those amber eyes. No fear, no anger, just a strange sort of understanding as Edmund hurled the water. It scattered the flowers and sent the cat running, but not far, just to the edge of the property line where it sat and watched. Edmund stood there breathing hard, the empty bucket trembling in his hands. For a moment, he felt victorious. Then he looked down at the scattered chrysanthemums, their petals torn and wilting, and felt something die inside him all over again. That evening brought the first real storm of the season. Rain lashed the windows and wind howled through the oak trees like a living thing. Edmund tried to focus on his evening routine, dinner, reports, brandy, but found himself drawn repeatedly to the windows. Was the cat out there somewhere, cold and wet because of his cruelty? At midnight, unable to sleep, he walked to the library door. His hand found the key he'd hidden away 3 years ago. The lock turned with a soft click, and Edmund stepped into the room that had been Margaret's heart. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her reading chair by the window, worn soft by years of use. Shelves lined with children's books and classic literature. The small stage where she'd performed puppet shows for delighted audiences of neighborhood kids. Even her reading glasses still sat on the side table, folded neatly beside a bookmark shaped like a cat. Edmund sank into her chair and buried his face in his hands. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment of absolute isolation. Then he heard it, a soft scratching at the library window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a familiar gray shape. The cat had somehow climbed onto the narrow ledge outside the window and was pawing gently at the pane, not frantically like an animal seeking shelter, but persistently, as if trying to deliver a message. Edmund stared at the cat, and the cat stared back. In its amber eyes he saw something that made his breath catch, not judgment for his earlier cruelty, but something that looked impossibly like forgiveness. "Clifton," he called, his voice hoarse. "Clifton, come quickly." The butler appeared within minutes, taking in the scene with remarkable composure. "Shall I let it in, sir?" Edmund hesitated, his pride warring with something deeper. Outside, the cat remained perfectly still on its precarious perch, rain soaking its fur but showing no intention of leaving. "Yes," Edmund whispered. "Let it in." As Clifton opened the window, the cat leaped gracefully into the room, shook itself once, and then did something extraordinary. Instead of exploring or seeking food, it walked directly to Edmund and settled at his feet, purring so softly it was almost inaudible. For the first time in 3 years, sitting in his late wife's chair with an unlikely companion warming his feet, Edmund Hale didn't feel completely alone, and something told him that this was only the beginning of a story that would shock everyone, especially himself. The cat had been living in the library for 2 weeks when Edmund finally gave it a name. It happened on a Thursday morning as he watched the animal systematically investigate every corner of the room with methodical precision, like a scholar cataloguing treasures. "Marlowe," Edmund said aloud, surprising himself. "Like the detective." The cat looked up at the sound, tilting its head as if considering whether the name suited. Then it returned to its exploration, apparently satisfied. Christopher Marlowe, Kit to his friends, had been Margaret's favorite playwright. She'd insisted on naming their goldfish after literary figures, a habit Edmund had once found charming, and later, after her death, painfully sentimental. But watching this grey cat move through the library with such purposeful intelligence, the name felt right. Marlowe had quickly established his own routine within the room. Mornings were spent stationed by the large window, watching the neighbourhood wake up. Afternoons found him curled in Margaret's reading chair, as if keeping it warm for her return. But it was the evenings that puzzled Edmund most. Every night, without fail, Marlowe positioned himself near the small air vent in the corner, sometimes pawing at the grate as if something important lay beyond it. "Probably mice," Edmund muttered to Clifton, though neither man had ever seen evidence of rodents in the meticulously maintained mansion. The library had become Edmund's refuge as well. He'd moved his morning coffee routine there, finding unexpected comfort in sharing the space with his feline companion. Marlowe never demanded attention, never imposed himself, but somehow his quiet presence made the silence less oppressive. Sometimes Edmund found himself talking to the cat, sharing thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Margaret used to read to children here every Saturday," he told Marlowe one morning, gesturing toward the small stage. 20 or 30 kids would pack in here, sitting on the floor, completely captivated by her voice. She had this way of bringing stories to life. His words trailed off as memories threatened to overwhelm him. Marlowe responded by jumping onto the stage and settling into what could only be described as a listening position, as if encouraging Edmund to continue. But Edmund couldn't. Not yet. The outside world, however, wouldn't let them be. Martha Hendricks and the Homeowners Association had escalated their complaints, threatening legal action if the feral animal wasn't removed. Edmund had ignored 3 certified letters and was now facing the possibility of fines and a formal hearing. "Perhaps we should consider finding Marlowe a proper home," Clifton suggested gently as he served Edmund's lunch. "Somewhere he'd be appreciated." The suggestion hit Edmund like a physical blow. "He has a home," he heard himself say. "Here." But that afternoon brought a crisis that tested Edmund's newfound resolve. Dr. Sarah Chen from the local animal shelter arrived unannounced, clipboard in hand and a carrier in her van. "Mr. Hale, I'm here about the stray cat reports. I have legal authority to remove animals that pose a public health risk." Edmund met her at the front door, his face set in grim lines. Dr. Chen was younger than he'd expected, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She didn't look like someone who'd relish taking away an old man's only companion. "The cat isn't stray," Edmund said firmly. "He belongs to me. Sir, I understand your attachment, but the reports indicate this animal appeared suddenly and may carry diseases. For everyone's safety, including yours, he needs to be examined and properly rehomed if necessary." "Examined here, then," Edmund countered. "I'll pay whatever fee you require." Dr. Chen hesitated, clearly not expecting this response. "Mr. Hale, I have to be honest. The complaints suggest your neighbors won't be satisfied with just a health check. They want the cat gone." Edmund felt his old rage rising, but something had changed in the past 2 weeks. The anger was no longer just destructive. It had purpose now, something to protect. "My neighbors," he said slowly. have spent 3 years treating me like a pariah because I chose to grieve privately. Now they want to dictate what happens on my own property. I think not. Doctor. Chen studied him for a long moment. May I see the cat? If he's clearly well cared for and properly socialized, it might help resolve the situation. Against his better judgment, Edmund led her to the library. Marlowe was in his usual afternoon spot, curled in Margaret's chair. When Dr. Chen entered, the cat raised his head and regarded her with calm interest. No fear, no aggression, just polite curiosity. "Well," Dr. Chen said softly, "he's certainly beautiful and clearly comfortable here." She approached slowly, extending her hand. Marlowe sniffed delicately, then allowed her to scratch behind his ears. "His coat is excellent, eyes are clear. He's obviously been eating well. He has impeccable taste in literature," Edmund found himself saying, surprising both of them with the comment. "He particularly enjoys the poetry section." Dr. Chen smiled, the first genuine expression Edmund had seen from a visitor in years. "A cultured cat. My favorite kind." She continued her gentle examination while Marlowe purred contentedly. "Mr. Hale, he's clearly thriving in your care. But I have to ask, are you prepared for the long-term commitment? Cats can live 15 years or more." The question caught Edmund off guard. At 72, was he being selfish, keeping an animal that might outlive him? But then Marlowe stretched and walked over to wind around his legs, and Edmund felt that now familiar crack in his carefully constructed emotional armor. "We'll figure it out as we go," he said quietly. Dr. Chen packed up her supplies. "I'll file a report stating that the cat is healthy, well cared for, and poses no public risk. That should address the legal concerns. As for your neighbors," she shrugged, "some people just like to complain." After she left, Edmund sat in the library feeling oddly shaken. The encounter had forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding. What was he doing? Was keeping Marlowe an act of compassion or selfishness? And why did the thought of losing the cat now terrify him more than the prospect of continued isolation? That evening, as if sensing his master's troubled thoughts, Marlowe abandoned his usual post by the air vent and jumped into Edmund's lap. The purring was louder than usual, almost medicinal in its steady rhythm. "You're a strange one, aren't you?" Edmund murmured, stroking the soft fur. "Showing up here like you knew something I didn't." Marlowe's amber eyes fixed on his with that unsettling intelligence. "Margaret would have loved you. She always said animals could see things in people that people couldn't see in themselves." As if responding to her name, Marlowe suddenly jumped down and walked purposefully to the corner where the air vent was located. His pawing became more insistent than usual, and he looked back at Edmund with what could only be described as urgency. "What is it, boy? What's got your attention down there?" Edmund got down on his hands and knees, something he hadn't done in decades, and peered at the vent grate. In the dim light, he could just make out something white wedged behind it. A piece of paper, maybe, or... His breath caught. With trembling fingers, he loosened the grate and retrieved a folded envelope, yellowed with age. His name was written on it in familiar handwriting, Margaret's elegant script. Inside was a letter dated just 3 days before she died, when she'd been confined to bed but had somehow found the strength to write. Edmund's vision blurred as he read, "My dearest Edmund, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone, and I'm probably worried about you. I know how you retreat when you're hurt. I've watched you do it in business, with friends, even with me sometimes. But darling, don't let grief make you forget how to live. This library has seen so much love over the years. Children's laughter, the rustle of turning pages, the magic of stories shared. It feels wrong to think of it sitting empty and silent. Promise me you'll open it again someday, when you're ready. The world needs what you have to give, even if you can't see it right now. I love you more than all the words in all these books combined. Don't let that love become a wall. Let it be a bridge. Forever yours, Margaret P.S. I've hidden this where only someone truly ready to live again would think to look. If you found it, I'm proud of you." Edmund clutched the letter to his chest and wept, the first real tears he'd shed since Margaret's funeral. Marlowe curled up beside him, a warm presence in the darkness of his grief. When the tears finally stopped, something had shifted. The library no longer felt like a shrine to the past, but like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And somehow, impossibly, a grey cat named Marlowe had been the key to finding that promise again. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, but inside the library something warmer than any fire was finally beginning to kindle. Edmund looked down at Marlowe, who gazed back with those knowing amber eyes, and wondered if cats could really see the future, because it seemed like this one had known exactly what Edmund needed, even before Edmund knew it himself. The next morning would bring new challenges, new reasons for his neighbors to complain, and new tests of his slowly awakening courage. But tonight, reading Margaret's letter by lamplight, with Marlowe purring in his lap, Edmund Hale felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. The blizzard struck Greenwich on December 15th with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. What the weather service had predicted as light snow flurries became a full-scale nor'easter, dumping 18 inches in 12 hours and bringing wind gusts that howled like banshees through the oak trees. Edmund woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of something crashing outside. Through his bedroom window, he could see that the neighbor's ancient elm had fallen across their driveway, its branches heavy with snow. The power lines that ran behind the houses swayed dangerously in the wind. Marlowe appeared at his bedroom door, something Edmund still found remarkable after 2 months of cohabitation. The cat had somehow learned to open doors by jumping and pulling down on the handles, a skill that would have annoyed Edmund in any other animal, but seemed perfectly reasonable coming from Marlowe. "Can't sleep either?" Edmund asked, and Marlowe responded with a soft chirp that sounded almost conversational. They made their way to the library together, Edmund carrying a flashlight as backup. The power was still on, but the lights flickered ominously with each gust of wind. Marlowe immediately went to his favorite window perch and stared out into the swirling snow with intense focus. By dawn, the storm had knocked out power to half of Greenwich. The Hale mansion, with its backup generators and redundant systems, hummed along normally, while the rest of the neighborhood sat in darkness. Edmund might have remained blissfully unaware of his neighbor's plight, if not for Marlowe's increasingly agitated behavior. The cat paced between the library window and the door, meowing insistently. When Edmund ignored him, Marlowe did something unprecedented. He jumped onto Edmund's lap and placed both paws on his chest, staring directly into his eyes with unmistakable urgency. "What's gotten into you?" Edmund muttered, but he followed the cat to the window. Through the snow he could see lights flickering in several houses, not electric lights, but the warm glow of candles and oil lamps. Emergency lighting. His neighbors were freezing in the dark while he sat in comfort. "It's not my problem," Edmund said aloud, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Marlowe responded with a look that could only be described as disappointed. The knock came at 10 o'clock. Edmund peered through the peephole to see Martha Hendricks standing on his front porch, bundled in a heavy coat and looking thoroughly miserable. Behind her stood Dr. Sarah Chen, whom Edmund recognized from the animal control visit. He opened the door reluctantly. "Mrs. Hendricks, Dr. Chen, rather early for a social call." Martha's usual imperious manner was notably absent. "Mr. Hale, we're sorry to bother you, but with the power out and Mrs. Peterson's oxygen concentrator not working, we were wondering if you might have a generator we could borrow, just until the power comes back on." Edmund looked past them to the street, where other neighbors huddled together for warmth. He recognized faces from the Homeowners Association, the same people who had demanded Marlowe's removal just weeks earlier. His first instinct was to send them away, let them figure out their own problems for once. But then he felt something brush against his legs. Marlowe had appeared beside him and was staring up at the visitors with what looked like expectation, as if he was waiting to see what kind of man his human companion really was. "I don't have a portable generator," Edmund said slowly. Martha's face fell. "But I do have this house. How many people need shelter?" The next few hours transformed the Hale mansion in ways Edmund never could have imagined. Mrs. Peterson, a 78-year-old widow with emphysema, was settled in the front parlor with her oxygen concentrator plugged into Edmund's power supply. The Rodriguez family from 3 houses down occupied the living room, their 2 young children marveling at the high ceilings and crystal chandelier. Dr. Chen had insisted on staying to monitor Mrs. Peterson, though Edmund suspected her real motivation was curiosity about the reclusive millionaire who had suddenly opened his doors. Clifton rose to the occasion magnificently, somehow producing hot soup, coffee, and sandwiches for everyone. The formal dining room that had stood empty for 3 years now buzzed with conversation and the clink of borrowed silverware. But it was Marlowe who truly stole the show. The cat moved among the visitors like a gracious host, allowing the children to pet him, curling up next to Mrs. Peterson's chair to provide comfort, and somehow managing to be exactly where he was needed most. Edmund watched in fascination as his antisocial pet displayed social graces that put most humans to shame. "He's remarkable," Dr. Chen said, settling beside Edmund in the library while the others rested. "I've never seen a cat so attuned to people's emotional needs." "He appeared out of nowhere," Edmund admitted. "Sometimes I think he knows things I don't. Maybe he does. Animals often sense what we need before we realize it ourselves." She paused, watching Marlowe gently headbutt little Maria Rodriguez. "Mrs. Hendricks told me about the complaints, about wanting him removed." Edmund stiffened. "And I think she's regretting that now. Look at how he's interacting with everyone. He's like a therapy animal, but with no training." As if summoned by their conversation, Martha Hendricks appeared in the library doorway. Her usual perfectly coiffed appearance was disheveled, her makeup smudged with exhaustion, but her expression was softer than Edmund had seen in years. "Mr. Hale, I wanted to thank you, and to apologize for the complaints about your cat. He's been wonderful with everyone today." Edmund felt that familiar crack in his emotional armor. "People change their minds," he said carefully. "Circumstances change perspectives." "Yes, they do." Martha looked around the library, taking in the children's books, the small stage, the cozy reading nook. "I remember when Margaret used to host story time here. My grandson Tommy used to beg to come every Saturday." The comment hit Edmund like a physical blow. He'd forgotten that Martha had grandchildren, that she'd once been part of their social circle, that before grief had turned him inward, they'd actually been friends. "She loved those Saturday mornings," he said quietly. "Would you—" Martha hesitated. "Would you ever consider opening the library again for the children? I know it's a lot to ask, but seeing this space today, remembering how magical it used to be..." Edmund's first instinct was to refuse. The library was his sanctuary now, his private space with Marlowe. But as he looked around the room, seeing it filled with people again, Dr. Chen browsing the medical journals, little Maria curled up with a picture book, Mrs. Peterson dozing peacefully in Margaret's chair, he realized something had shifted. The space didn't feel violated by their presence. It felt complete. "I'll consider it," he heard himself say. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time the power was restored, something irreversible had happened. The Hale mansion had been breached, its silence broken, its isolation ended. Edmund had seen his neighbors not as critics or threats, but as people with their own struggles and needs. And they had seen him not as the bitter recluse they'd imagined, but as a man capable of extraordinary generosity. More importantly, they had all seen Marlowe work his quiet magic, bridging gaps and healing wounds with nothing more than his presence and an inexplicable ability to know exactly where he was needed most. The local newspaper ran a story about the storm shelter, calling Edmund a good Samaritan and featuring a photo of Marlowe curled up with the Rodriguez children. The article quoted Dr. Chen calling the cat a natural therapy animal and Martha Hendricks admitting that the Homeowners Association had been hasty in their judgment. Edmund kept the newspaper clipping on his desk, though he grumbled about invasion of privacy and sensationalist journalism. But late at night, when he thought no one was watching, he would read the article again, studying the photo of Marlowe surrounded by children, seeing his pet, his friend, through the eyes of others for the first time. "You planned this, didn't you?" he asked Marlowe one evening as they sat together in the library. "The storm shelter, the newspaper story, all of it." Marlowe regarded him with those inscrutable amber eyes and began to purr, which Edmund chose to interpret as confirmation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the mansion, something warmer than any fire was burning. For the first time in 3 years, Edmund Hale was no longer alone in the world, and somehow, a grey cat named Marlowe had orchestrated it all. But even as he reveled in this new sense of connection, Edmund couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Marlowe seemed to have plans that extended far beyond one winter storm, and Edmund was both curious and terrified to discover what they might be. Spring came early to Greenwich, and with it, a decision that would change everything. The invitation arrived on official Town of Greenwich letterhead, signed by Mayor Patricia Collins herself. The Town Council was proposing to designate the Hale Mansion Library as a community literary centre, complete with funding for renovations, programming, and a full-time coordinator. Edmund stared at the letter, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Marlowe sat on his desk, apparently reading over his shoulder with the same intensity his master displayed. "They want to formalize it," Edmund said aloud. "Turn Margaret's library into an official community center." The proposal was actually quite generous. The town would provide $50,000 annually for programming, materials, and staffing, while Edmund would maintain ownership and have final approval over all activities. It was essentially what Martha Hendricks had suggested during the blizzard, but now backed by municipal support and community enthusiasm. Clifton entered with the morning mail, glancing at the official documents scattered across the desk. "Good news, I hope, sir." "I'm not sure what it is," Edmund admitted. "They want to bring back the children's programming. Story hours, reading clubs, literacy tutoring, everything Margaret used to do, but bigger." "And how does that make you feel?" It was an unusually personal question from his reserved butler, but Edmund had noticed that 3 months of living with Marlowe had changed all their boundaries. The cat seemed to encourage deeper conversations, more honest exchanges. "Terrified," Edmund said honestly. "What if I can't do it justice? What if I ruin Margaret's memory by trying to recreate what she built?" Marlowe jumped down from the desk and padded over to the corner where they'd found Margaret's letter. He sat there pointedly, as if reminding Edmund of his wife's words. "Don't let that love become a wall. Let it be a bridge." The deciding moment came the following Saturday. Dr. Sarah Chen had been stopping by weekly since the blizzard, officially to check on Mrs. Peterson's continuing recovery. But really, Edmund suspected, because she'd become genuinely fond of Marlowe and curious about the mansion's transformation. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. "I brought someone to meet you," she said, leading a small figure into the library. "This is Jamie Morrison. He's 8 years old and one of my neighbors." The boy was small for his age, with unruly brown hair and thick glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He stood close to Dr. Chen's side, clearly nervous about meeting the famous Mr. Hale and his remarkable cat. "Jamie loves to read," Dr. Chen continued, "but he has some social anxiety that makes it hard for him to participate in regular library programs. I thought maybe—" She didn't need to finish. Marlowe had already spotted the newcomer and was approaching with his tail held high in welcome. Instead of his usual confident stride, though, the cat moved slowly, stopping several feet away and settling into a relaxed position that clearly said, "I'm here if you want me, but no pressure." Jamie's eyes went wide behind his glasses. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "His name is Marlowe," Edmund said, finding himself instinctively lowering his voice to match the boy's quiet tone. "He's quite particular about his books. Would you like to see his favorites?" What followed was one of the most remarkable hours Edmund had experienced since Margaret's death. Jamie's shyness melted away as Marlowe gently supervised their tour of the library. The boy had a voracious appetite for stories and an impressive vocabulary for his age. When Edmund pulled out a volume of poetry that had been one of Margaret's treasures, Jamie's face lit up with recognition. "My mum reads me poems sometimes," he said, "but she says some are too grown up for me." "Poetry is like music," Edmund found himself saying, channeling words he'd heard Margaret speak countless times. "Sometimes you don't understand all the words, but you can still feel what the poet is trying to say." He read aloud from Robert Frost, while Jamie and Marlowe curled up together in the big reading chair. The boy's eyes never left Edmund's face, hanging on every word with an attention that was both flattering and humbling. When Dr. Chen returned to collect Jamie, the boy was reluctant to leave. "Can I come back next Saturday?" he asked. "Maybe Marlowe could show me more books?" After they left, Edmund sat alone in the library, feeling shaken. The joy on Jamie's face, the way Marlowe had instinctively known how to put the shy child at ease, the natural rhythm of reading and sharing stories, it had all felt so right, so much like what Margaret had always intended for this space. That evening, he called Mayor Collins. "I'd like to discuss your proposal," he said, "but with some modifications." The meeting took place the following week in the library itself, with Marlowe serving as unofficial host to Mayor Collins, the town librarian, a representative from the education department, and Martha Hendricks, representing the neighborhood association. Edmund had spent days preparing his counteroffer, but when the moment came, he found his inspiration came from an unexpected source. "I want this to be more than just a children's program," he began. watching Marlowe wind between the visitors' chairs with his usual diplomatic grace. "I've been thinking about what my wife would have wanted, what this space could become." He outlined his vision, a true community center that served all ages, morning story times for toddlers, after-school tutoring for struggling readers, adult literacy classes, and evening book clubs for seniors. The renovated carriage house could become a small cafe, staffed by volunteers and serving as a casual meeting space. The gardens would be restored with reading nooks scattered among the flowers. "Most importantly," Edmund continued, "I want to establish the Margaret Hale Memorial Fund for Literacy. Any child who needs books, tutoring, or educational support would receive it free of charge." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Mayor Collins smiled. "Mr. Hale, that's considerably more ambitious than our original proposal. The funding would need to be 3 times what we discussed." "I'll match whatever the town provides," Edmund said quietly. "Dollar for dollar." Martha Hendricks leaned forward. "Edmund, are you sure? That's a substantial commitment." For the first time since Margaret's death, Edmund felt absolutely certain about something. It's what she would have wanted, and it's what this community needs. Marlowe chose that moment to jump onto the table where the documents were spread, settling himself directly on top of the funding proposals. Everyone laughed, and the tension in the room dissolved. "I think that's a yes from our feline advisor," Mayor Collins said, gently moving Marlowe to scratch behind his ears. "Mr. Hale, if you're serious about this commitment, we can have the paperwork drawn up by next month." "I'm serious," Edmund said, and meant it. The transformation began immediately. Word spread through Greenwich that the reclusive millionaire was not only opening his mansion to the community, but investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in literacy programs. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story, this time featuring a photo of Edmund reading to Jamie Morrison, while Marlowe supervised from his perch on the chair arm. But with the excitement came challenges Edmund hadn't anticipated. The renovation process meant strangers tramping through his home daily, contractors, designers, city inspectors. His carefully controlled environment became a construction zone of sawdust and paint fumes. Some days, the noise and chaos made him want to retreat to his old patterns of isolation. It was during one particularly overwhelming afternoon, when the carriage house renovation had triggered his security system 3 times and a paint delivery had blocked his driveway, that Edmund reached his breaking point. "This was a mistake," he told Clifton, pacing in the one quiet room they'd managed to preserve. "I'm not cut out for this level of disruption. Maybe I should just donate the money and let someone else handle the actual programs." Marlowe appeared in the doorway as if summoned by his distress. But instead of offering his usual comforting presence, the cat did something unexpected. He walked to the library door and sat down, blocking Edmund's path out of the room. "Move, Marlowe. I need to call Mayor Collins and withdraw from this project." Marlowe didn't budge. When Edmund tried to step around him, the cat repositioned himself directly in Edmund's way, golden eyes fixed on his master with unmistakable determination. "You're being ridiculous," Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something in Marlowe's expression, a kind of gentle stubbornness that reminded him powerfully of Margaret during her most determined moments. A soft knock interrupted their standoff. Jamie Morrison stood in the doorway with Dr. Chen, holding a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Hale, I brought you something," Jamie said shyly. "Mom helped me make it." Inside the wrapping was a hand-drawn book titled Marlowe's Library in careful block letters. Each page featured crayon illustrations of the cat in different areas of the library, with accompanying stories written in Jamie's neat handwriting. The final page showed Edmund, Marlowe, and Jamie reading together under a tree, with the caption, "The best stories happen when friends share books." Edmund felt his throat close up as he turned through the pages. The simple drawings captured not just Marlowe's appearance, but his personality, his curiosity, his gentleness, his uncanny ability to know exactly where he was needed most. "It's beautiful, Jamie," Edmund managed. "But why did you make this for me?" "Because you and Marlowe gave me a place where I don't have to be scared," Jamie said simply. "And Dr. Chen said you might be feeling scared too about all the changes. But change can be good when it helps more people feel safe." Out of the mouths of babes, Edmund thought, looking down at the boy's earnest face. How had an 8-year-old managed to understand what he himself had been struggling to grasp? That evening, after the contractors had left and the mansion had returned to relative quiet, Edmund sat in the library with Marlowe curled in his lap, and Jamie's book spread open on the side table. The cat's purring was a steady, comforting rhythm that seemed to sync with Edmund's heartbeat. "You knew, didn't you?" Edmund said softly. "When you blocked that door, when you wouldn't let me run away, you knew Jamie was coming with exactly what I needed to hear." Marlowe's amber eyes regarded him with what could only be described as satisfaction, not smugness, but the quiet pleasure of a job well done. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Word about the literary center had spread beyond Greenwich, and a delegation from the Connecticut State Library arrived to discuss making the Hale Mansion a pilot program for rural literacy initiatives. Edmund found himself in the position of community leader, a role he'd never sought but was discovering he could handle, with Marlowe's steady presence as support. More surprisingly, former business associates began reaching out. People Edmund had shut out during his grieving years were suddenly interested in reconnecting, in supporting his literacy mission, in being part of something meaningful. His voluntary exile was ending not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. The library reopened officially on a Saturday morning in May, exactly 1 year after Marlowe had first appeared on Edmund's doorstep. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew over 100 people, families with children, teenagers volunteering as reading tutors, seniors excited about the new book clubs. Local news crews filmed as Mayor Collins handed Edmund an oversized pair of scissors. But the real star of the show was Marlowe, who positioned himself on the library steps like a feline greeter, allowing children to pet him and somehow managing to pose for photos without looking remotely annoyed by the attention. "I keep waiting for him to get overwhelmed by all these people," Dr. Chen told Edmund as they watched Marlowe graciously accept adulation from a group of kindergartners. "But he seems to thrive on it. He's a natural performer," Edmund replied. Margaret would have loved that about him. As the crowd dispersed and the official ceremonies ended, Edmund found himself alone in the library for the first time since the renovations began. The space had been transformed, but not beyond recognition. Margaret's original vision was still there, just expanded and enhanced. The reading nooks were more comfortable, the children's section was brighter, and new technology had been seamlessly integrated with the classic charm. Marlowe jumped onto Edmund's lap as he settled into Margaret's old chair, now officially designated as the Reader's Chair, with a small brass plaque bearing her name. "We did it," Edmund whispered into Marlowe's fur. "We actually did it." The cat's purring intensified, and Edmund could have sworn he heard satisfaction in that rumbling sound. Outside, the restored gardens bloomed with spring flowers, and through the open windows came the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood. Children who would soon fill these rooms with laughter and learning. For the first time since Margaret's death, Edmund Hale felt not just alive, but purposeful. And it had all started with a grey cat who refused to take no for an answer, who saw past the walls of grief to the man who still had love to give. Tomorrow would bring the first official story time, with Jamie Morrison as the guest reader and Marlowe as the supervisor of festivities. But tonight it was enough to sit in the quiet library, surrounded by books and possibilities, with his unlikely savior purring in his lap, and the future stretching ahead like an unwritten story waiting to be told. 6 months after the library's grand reopening, Edmund stood at his bedroom window watching the first snow of winter dust, the gardens below. The scene was peaceful, almost magical, but his mind was troubled. In his hand he held a letter that had arrived that morning, an offer to purchase his story for a major publishing house, complete with movie rights and a substantial advance. The Millionaire and the Cat, a true story of transformation, they wanted to call it. Edmund had initially dismissed the idea when the writer first approached him weeks earlier, but the persistent journalist had returned with this formal proposal that was hard to ignore. Marlowe appeared at his elbow, as if sensing his master's inner turmoil. The cat had developed an uncanny ability to materialize whenever Edmund needed him most, though after 18 months together, Edmund had stopped questioning this phenomenon. "What do you think, old friend?" Edmund asked, scratching behind Marlowe's ears. "Should we let them turn us into a bestseller?" Marlowe's response was to jump onto the windowsill and stare pointedly at the library building, where early morning light revealed children already gathering for Saturday story time. Even through the closed windows, Edmund could hear faint sounds of excitement and laughter. The library had exceeded every expectation. The children's programs were booked solid. The adult literacy classes had waiting lists, and the evening book clubs had become social events that brought together people from across Connecticut. Jamie Morrison, now 9 and significantly more confident, served as Marlowe's official assistant librarian, helping other shy children feel comfortable in the space. But success had brought unexpected complications. The constant stream of visitors, media attention, and requests for interviews had begun to feel overwhelming. Some days Edmund felt like he was living in a fishbowl, with every interaction scrutinized and every decision analyzed by people who wanted to understand the miracle of his transformation. Dr. Sarah Chen found him in the library an hour later, reading the publishing contract while Marlowe supervised from his favorite perch on the desk. "Big decision?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Sarah had become not just Marlowe's unofficial veterinarian, but one of Edmund's closest friends, a development that still surprised him. "They want to turn this into a story," Edmund said, waving the contract. "The redemptive power of animal companionship, the healing nature of community service, the triumph of love over loss." He sounded cynical, but Sarah caught the uncertainty underneath. "And that bothers you?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment, watching Marlowe groom his silver fur with characteristic precision. "It feels like it reduces everything to a simple fable. Man meets cat, cat changes man, everyone lives happily ever after." But it wasn't simple, Sarah. It was messy and complicated and sometimes painful. "The best stories usually are," she pointed out gently. Before Edmund could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the library windows, they could see a news van pulling up to the mansion's front gate. A reporter and cameraman were setting up equipment, clearly preparing for another human interest piece about the famous cat and his millionaire companion. Edmund's jaw tightened. "This is exactly what I mean. We can't have a quiet Saturday morning without someone wanting to turn it into content." Marlowe suddenly jumped down from his perch and trotted toward the library's main entrance. A moment later, the first children began arriving for story time, including Jamie Morrison, who had promised to read from his latest homemade book about Marlowe's adventures. "Mr. Hale," Jamie called out as he spotted Edmund. "Did you see? There's a TV truck outside. Are we going to be famous?" Other children crowded around, chattering excitedly about the possibility of being on television. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Edmund found his irritation beginning to fade. These children didn't see media attention as an invasion of privacy. They saw it as validation that their special library was worth celebrating. "What do you think, Marlowe?" Jamie asked the cat seriously. "Should we let them film us reading stories?" Marlowe's response was to walk directly to his favorite spot on the small stage where Margaret used to perform puppet shows. He settled himself in perfect view of the windows, as if posing for the cameras outside. The children dissolved into giggles. "He wants to be a movie star," laughed Maria Rodriguez, now 10 and one of the library's most devoted patrons. Edmund watched this interaction with growing clarity. The publishing contract, the media attention, the constant scrutiny, none of it was really about him. It was about the story itself and the hope it represented for others who might be struggling with loss, loneliness, or the fear of opening their hearts again. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what if we did agree to the book deal but with conditions?" "What kind of conditions?" "All proceeds go to literacy programs, not just here but nationwide. And the story focuses not on me, but on the power of community, of libraries, of—" He gestured toward Marlowe, who was now accepting gentle pets from a group of kindergartners, "of connections that transcend species." Sarah smiled. That sounds like something Margaret would have approved of. The mention of his wife's name no longer brought the sharp stab of pain Edmund had grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, he felt a warm sense of her presence, as if she were watching approvingly from somewhere just beyond his vision. The morning's story time was one of their best ever. Jamie read with growing confidence while Marlowe provided comic relief by occasionally batting at the pages or repositioning himself for better dramatic effect. The news crew, initially intrusive, became almost invisible as they captured the genuine joy of children discovering the magic of storytelling. During the lunch break, while the children played in the restored gardens, Edmund found himself in conversation with the reporter, a young woman named Lisa Park, who had driven up from New York City specifically to cover the story. "Mr. Hale, what would you say to people who are skeptical about the transformative power of pet ownership?" she asked, microphone in hand. Edmund considered the question carefully. "I'd say they're asking the wrong question," he replied. "This isn't about pet ownership. It's about being open to unexpected connections, about allowing ourselves to be vulnerable enough to love and be loved in return. Marlowe didn't transform me because he's a cat. He transformed me because he refused to accept my isolation as permanent. And what advice would you give to someone who's struggling with loss or loneliness? Edmund looked through the library window, where he could see Marlowe surrounded by children completely in his element. "Don't close all the doors," he said simply. "Leave at least one open, even just a crack. You never know what might choose to walk through it." That evening, after the news crew had packed up and the children had gone home, Edmund sat in the library with the publishing contract spread before him. Marlowe was in his lap, purring steadily, while Sarah and Clifton offered their perspectives on the various clauses and conditions. But Edmund's attention was drawn to something else, a small stack of handwritten letters that had accumulated over the past few months. They came from all over the country, from people who had heard about the Hale Mansion Library and wanted to share their own stories of transformation, connection, and hope. There was the elderly widower in Oregon who had started volunteering at his local animal shelter after reading about Edmund's story. The shy teenager in Alabama who had overcome social anxiety by reading to therapy cats at a nursing home. The divorced mother in Michigan who had opened her home to foster kittens and found her children's grief over the divorce beginning to heal. "They're not writing to me," Edmund realized aloud. "They're writing to thank Marlowe and Margaret's library, and the idea that it's never too late to open your heart again." He picked up his pen and signed the contract with a steady hand. If their story could inspire even one person to take a chance on connection, to choose hope over fear, then the invasion of privacy was a small price to pay. Marlowe stretched and settled more comfortably in Edmund's lap, as if approving of the decision. Outside, snow continued to fall on the gardens, where spring flowers would soon bloom again. The cycle of seasons, the rhythm of renewal, the endless possibility of new beginnings, all of it seemed to center on this warm library where love had returned to take up residence. A year later, when The Cat Who Saved Christmas, as the publishers ultimately titled it, hit the bestseller lists, Edmund was neither surprised nor particularly interested in the fame. What mattered was the flood of letters from readers, the donations pouring into literacy programs across the country, and the steady stream of visitors who came not to gawk at a celebrity cat, but to experience the magic of a library where every person, regardless of age, background, or circumstance, was welcome. Marlowe, for his part, seemed to take his celebrity status in stride. He continued his daily routines of greeting visitors, supervising story time, and providing comfort to anyone who needed it. Sometimes Edmund wondered if the cat understood how many lives he had touched, how many hearts he had helped to heal. But then Marlowe would look at him with those wise amber eyes, and Edmund would realize that understanding was never the point. Love simply was, and that was enough. On quiet evenings, when the library was empty and the mansion settled into peaceful silence, Edmund would sit in Margaret's old chair with Marlowe on his lap and feel overwhelmed by gratitude, not just for the cat, who had refused to accept his rejection, but for the community that had welcomed them both, for the children whose laughter filled rooms that had known too much silence, and for the endless capacity of the human heart to heal and love again. "We did good work together, didn't we?" he would whisper into Marlowe's fur, and the answering purr seemed to say, "The best work is yet to come." Outside, Greenwich slept under its blanket of stars, but inside the Hale Mansion, love kept watch through the night, patient and enduring and forever ready to welcome the next unlikely visitor who might need a second chance at happiness. The story that had begun with a millionaire's cruel rejection of an uninvited guest had become something neither of them could have imagined, a testament to the transformative power of persistence, compassion, and the simple act of refusing to give up on someone, even when they had given up on themselves. And in the end, that was the only story worth telling. In the years that followed, the Margaret Hale Memorial Library became a model for community-centered literacy programs across the nation. Marlowe lived to the remarkable age of 19, touching thousands of lives and proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of love can create the largest waves of change. Edmund Hale, who had once thought his story was over, discovered that it was really just beginning, and that the best chapters are often written by the most unexpected authors. They say love comes to those who wait, but sometimes it comes to those who simply leave the door open wide enough for a grey cat with amber eyes and an indomitable spirit to walk through. In Greenwich, Connecticut, in a mansion that was once a monument to isolation, they learned that the heart remembers how to hope, and that redemption often arrives on four paws, carrying gifts we never knew we needed.